All right, welcome back, guys. We are continuing with our content regarding cardiovascular system. So let's see where we left off. Where we left off, we were talking about the chambers of the heart. We mentioned how there are four chambers. You have two chambers on the top, which are going to be the atria, two chambers on the bottom, which are the ventricles. Remember, the atria are the receiving chambers, so they receive blood, whereas the ventricles are the discharging chambers, so they're going to release blood and send blood out to the rest of the body. I really love this picture. I think this picture does a great job, and this diagram does a great job of describing the circulation. Granted, there's more steps to circulation that we will need to learn, but this is a great step one. So I like starting on the right side of the heart, which is the left side of the image, because remember, you mirror image it. I like starting on the right side of the heart because I think it's easier to recognize it this way. But before we get there, let's start here. It's what's called the systemic circuit. We're going to learn more about that in the coming days in our videos. But you notice how there's a lot of this blood moving through the body that's now pooling together, and it's this blue color. We don't have blue colored blood, as we learned in our circulatory unit, but in medical diagrams, they color it blue to indicate that it's oxygen poor, or also known as deoxygenated. If it's oxygen poor, that also means it's rich in carbon dioxide, because remember, in respiratory system, we talked about how these gases have a yin and yang relationship. So we're going to have a ton of this deoxygenated blood moving upward. Where does all this deoxygenated blood come from? Well, it's because the body is using all that oxygen that we breathe in. That makes sense. So it's going to come upward up until the right atrium, and that's where it's going to pool together. From the right atrium, it's going to deposit into the right ventricle. Then the right ventricle is going to squeeze and eject this blood into the lungs. Now, when it's in the lungs, that's when it's going to go through what's called the pulmonary circuit. And we're going to learn more about that as well. But we've technically learned about that in respiratory system because the whole point of the pulmonary circuit is gas exchange. Gas exchange occurs so you can get rid of all that carbon dioxide and pick up all this rich oxygen, which turns it into a reddish color. Now that it's oxygenated, it's going to drop off the blood into the left atrium, drop into the left ventricle, which notice the left ventricle is actually thicker than the right, and there's a distinct reason for that. Then the left ventricle is going to squeeze and send that blood to the rest of the body. Why is the left ventricle thicker than the right? Well, think of it anatomically. You don't really see it in this picture that well, but anatomically speaking, the heart is right between the lungs, right? So when the right ventricle squeezes and you see that it sends blood to the lungs, there's not a lot of distance. It doesn't require a lot of force to get to the lungs. So that's why the left ventricle, when it sends blood and it's squeezing, it's sending blood to literally the rest of the body. It's going to require a lot more force to do that. So the left ventricle, for that reason, is thicker. Let's talk about valves. Let's get into information regarding the valves because there's quite a bit of information that we can discuss here. The point of the valves is to allow blood to flow in one direction and one direction only. You do not want a counterflow occurring. So you always just want blood to flow in one direction. There are four valves that are found in the heart, and these valves can be broken into two categories. So let's talk about the categories. We first have the atrioventricular valves, or just shorthand into AV valves. Now, if you break that word down, it actually tells you what's going on. Atrio means atria, which are the top chambers. Ventricular means ventricle, which is the bottom chambers. So suddenly we know that these valves are separating the top parts of the heart from the bottom parts of the heart. Atrioventricular. There are two AV valves that we need to know, the bicuspid and the tricuspid valve. Now, notice here, very important, that the bicuspid valve is also known as the mitral valve. That is just another name that you'll see. Keep that in mind. The bicuspid valve or the mitral valve is found on the left side of the heart, whereas the tricuspid valve is found on the right. If you were to do a dissection of the heart and you look inside the heart, you'll actually see that the bicuspid valve only has two little flaps, whereas the tricuspid valve has three. So because of that, we can identify, bicuspid means two, tricuspid means three. That's the prefix. Next, we have the semilunar valves. The semilunar valves are interesting. They're not named because of location. They're named because of shape. They're shaped like a crescent moon or a sickle or a banana. It's all the same shape, right? So that's what these are shaped like. And they're separating the ventricles from their appropriate artery. How do we learn which artery it's connecting to? Well, we first got to learn the vessels, and that's what our last content will be for this video. So we'll come back to this stuff a little bit later. But the key thing to recognize regarding the semilunar valves is the first word. So pulmonary semilunar and aortic semilunar. Pulmonary, you may remember from our respiratory content because pulmonary references lungs. So this is, you can already tell where we're kind of going with this. And then aortic is referencing one of the great vessels called the aorta. And we'll talk more about that as we progress as well. Okay, good. Moving on. There's a lot here. This is more information on the valves, sorry. Regarding the valves are going to open up as blood is pumped through them. You should know that there's a special structure in the valves that help to keep the valves in place called the chordae tendineae, or the heartstrings. Make sure we are aware of that. Literally, you may have heard of the phrase, "you're pulling on my heartstrings." You do have heartstrings, but they're there to hold the valves in place. Last but not least, very, very important. One of the most important purposes of having valves in the first place is to prevent backflow. You do not want blood to go in the opposite direction. Not good. Sometimes that does happen. And when that does happen, some issues can occur, which we're going to discuss in this video as well. All right. There's a lot going on in this picture, but honestly, this is a great image to discuss and just to better understand how valves work. On the left-hand side, this is everything involving the AV valves. You see the blood rushing into the atria filling up. Once the atria are full, they're going to apply so much pressure on the AV valves that they force open, right? Then, as the ventricles fill up and then the ventricles eject the blood, they're going to shut the atria or shut the AV valve so that no blood goes in the opposite direction. Same thing happens in the semilunars. The semilunar valves are forced open when the ventricles contract. When the blood has now entered the actual arteries, it's going to apply pressure on the semilunar valves, and it forces them to shut so that they don't enter the heart again. That's kind of what you see here in this picture. So this is very thorough, but it gives us a good understanding of what's happening. So let's talk a little bit about some pathology. What happens if there's a problem? Well, in the case of an incompetent valve, so in the case where there's a valve that's malfunctioning, it can cause backflow and thus cause a repump. Backflow is literally where blood goes in the opposite direction that it should have never gone. And then a repump, in the instance that blood goes in the opposite direction, the heart is then forced to squeeze again. It's a quick, back-to-back pump. That means the heart is going to start working harder than it ever should, which can lead to stiffness of the heart, causing a condition called stenosis. Not good. The good news is that the valves can be replaced surgically speaking. So if there's a circumstance that the valves are having problems, they can replace that. How do you tell that the valves may be having problems? You listen to the heart using a stethoscope. There are two distinct sounds that the heart makes. It's lub and dub. We're going to talk about that more before the unit ends because that's pretty important, especially in regards to how the valves work and a little bit about blood pressure as well. To conclude, we got to talk about the great vessels. So I'm going to move this here so I have some more space to write. I'll move this over here too. Okay, so these are the great vessels. These are all the vessels that are surrounding the heart. So these are rather large and important vessels. There's a lot of different vessels that are found in the body. We don't even learn a fraction of them. Well, I mean, technically it is a fraction, but we don't get into so many of them. We're just learning the key ones, especially relating to the heart. So let's start with the major one here, aorta. There's some information around the aorta we need to know. You should know that it is the largest artery of the body. So the aorta is the largest artery of the body by far. Massive artery. And there's a reason why it has to be so large. It leaves the left ventricle. So it's going to be leaving the left ventricle. And if you remember, the left side of the heart is oxygenated. It has oxygen-rich blood. Next, we have the pulmonary arteries. Remember, there's that word pulmonary. It means lungs. What's the unique trait about pulmonary arteries? Well, there's something very interesting here. Let me start that over again. Something very unique happening with the pulmonary arteries. They are the only arteries that are oxygen. Oops, got a little carried away with that. There you go. That are oxygen poor. Most arteries, as we're going to learn, are oxygen rich. 99% of our arteries, in fact, have a ton of oxygen. So this is the only example where you have arteries that have very little to no oxygen. What makes an artery, and we're going to learn about this in future videos, is that it sends blood away from the heart. And that's what's happening here. You're sending blood away from the heart, but you're sending blood that is deoxygenated because it's going towards the lungs. It needs to get oxygenated. So that's what you see here. It's leaving the right ventricle. Next, we have our vena cavas. Regarding the vena cavas, the thing that we need to know is that there are two vena cavas. It's pretty easy. You have the superior vena cava, and then you have your inferior vena cava. If you remember our terms from our very first unit, superior is going to be on top, inferior means below. That's it. You have two main veins. Last but not least, pulmonary veins. You're going to see a bit of a common theme here. Once again, pulmonary. Not a bad idea to know that we have four of them, by the way. But the unique thing about the pulmonary veins is that they are the only veins that are oxygen rich. The only veins that are oxygen rich. Most veins, 99% of veins, have little to no oxygen. If you look at the inside of your arm, right, and you see all these blue vessels, blue colored vessels, it's not really blue, right? It's like dark purple color. Those are all veins. They don't have oxygen. This is an example, though, that has oxygen because what makes a vein is that it sends blood back towards the heart. So remember pulmonary? These are vessels that are coming from the lungs back towards the heart that are oxygen rich, and it's entering the left atrium. So that's what really makes this vessel stand out. So these are the great vessels. We're going to talk more about them in future videos, no doubt. All right. So thanks for tuning in, guys. Hope you have a great one. I'll see you in the next one.